For decades, one of the biggest reasons people stayed on Windows had nothing to do with loving Windows itself. It was about the apps, the software, the tools people needed for work, gaming, school, or creativity. Adobe apps, Microsoft Office, professional engineering software, niche enterprise tools, obscure accounting programs, and of course, countless Windows-only games. Linux users learned to live with this reality. They dual-booted. They kept an old Windows machine around. They used virtual machines. They compromised. And for a very long time, the common phrase was, "Linux is great, but it can't run Windows apps natively." That sentence just quietly expired, and most people haven't realized yet how massive this change really is. What just happened in the Linux world isn't a single update or a flashy announcement from a big corporation. It's something far more dangerous to the status quo. Linux didn't try to copy Windows. It didn't beg developers to port everything. It didn't wait for Microsoft's permission. Instead, Linux evolved to a point where Windows apps are now running in ways that feel native, seamless, and shockingly fast. And no, this isn't the Linux of 10 years ago where you crossed your fingers and hoped a program launched. This is something entirely different. To understand why this changes everything, you have to understand what native really means in this context. Traditionally, native meant software compiled specifically for your operating system, using its system calls, libraries, and APIs directly. Windows apps used Win32.net, DirectX, and other Windows-specific layers. Linux apps used POSIX X11 or Wayland, GTK, Qt, and a completely different stack. These worlds were never meant to talk to each other. For years, compatibility layers were considered hacks. Interesting, but unreliable. Useful, but limited. That perception is now outdated. The modern Linux ecosystem has quietly built something that looks less like a compatibility layer and more like an alternative Windows runtime. Wine used to be seen as a clever experiment. Today, it's a highly optimized, constantly evolving system that translates Windows system calls into Linux calls with astonishing accuracy. Proton, built on top of Wine, took that foundation and supercharged it for gaming. Then Valve poured real money, real engineers, and real pressure into making it good. Not good for Linux, just good, period. And once gaming crossed that line, everything else followed. Today, Windows applications are launching on Linux with performance that often matches or even beats native Windows. Load times are shorter, frame pacing is smoother. CPU overhead is lower in many cases. That sounds impossible until you realize what Windows has become. Windows is no longer a lean operating system. It's layered with telemetry, background services, ads, cloud hooks, and forced integrations. Linux, by contrast, gives these Windows apps a cleaner, lighter environment to run in. The irony is delicious. But this story isn't just about Wine or Proton. It's about a convergence of technologies that finally aligned at the same time. Linux graphics drivers matured. Vulkan became a first-class citizen. DXVK and VKD3 detranslated DirectX calls to Vulkan with absurd efficiency. Wayland fixed long-standing display issues. Pipewire, unified audio and video, Flatpak and containerization solved dependency hell. Desktop environments became polished and user-friendly. And suddenly, the last big excuse to stay on Windows started to crumble. What really makes this moment different is how invisible the process has become. You install a Windows app on Linux now, and in many cases, you don't even think about compatibility layers. You click install, you click run, it opens, it works, it updates, it saves files where you expect them, it integrates with your desktop theme, it respects your system settings, it behaves like it belongs there. That psychological shift is massive. For years, Linux users were the ones making excuses. It works if you tweak it. There's a workaround. You can use an alternative. Now it's Windows users who are making excuses. Yeah, Linux can run it, but Windows is still easier. That statement is becoming less true every month. Even Microsoft seems to understand this shift, whether they want to admit it or not. The Windows subsystem for Linux started as a curiosity. Then it became a selling point. Then it became essential. Microsoft needed Linux inside Windows to stay relevant with developers. Meanwhile, Linux quietly learned how to run Windows software without Windows. That asymmetry should worry Redmond far more than flashy headlines. Another piece of this puzzle is how Linux distributions are packaging these tools. Steam made Proton invisible. Lutris made managing Windows games trivial. Bottles turned complex wine setups into click hand-run containers. Heroic Launcher made Epic Game Store and GOG feel native. Even professional software workflows are benefiting. Engineers are running Windows CAD tools. Musicians are running VST plugins. Designers are running legacy creative software, all on Linux, all without rebooting. And let's talk about performance, because this is where the narrative completely flips. Many people assume translation layers must be slower. In theory, yes. In practice, not always. Linux's scheduler, memory management, and file system performance often outperform Windows, especially on modern hardware. When a Windows app runs through Proton or Wine, it's bypassing a lot of Windows overhead. The result is a weird but very real phenomenon where the Windows version of a game or app runs better on Linux than on Windows itself. That's not marketing. That's benchmarks. Security is another angle people are underestimating. Windows apps running on Linux don't have the same level of system access they expect on Windows. They're sandboxed, contained, and isolated. Malware designed for Windows assumptions often fails silently on Linux. Ransomware that relies on Windows APIs hits a wall. That alone is enough to make enterprise IT departments take notice. Now imagine the long-term implications. If Linux can run Windows apps reliably, developers no longer have to choose sides. Users no longer have to stay locked into a single operating system for one program. The leverage shifts. Operating systems stop being app gatekeepers and start being environments of choice. That's terrifying for companies whose entire business model depends on lock-in. This also changes how hardware decisions are made. Linux already dominates servers, cloud infrastructure, supercomputers, and embedded systems. Desktop Linux was the missing piece. Not because it wasn't good, but because it lacked compatibility. That gap is closing fast. When your laptop runs Linux, your server runs Linux, your containers run Linux, and your desktop apps also run on Linux, the ecosystem becomes unified. That's incredibly powerful. There's also a cultural shift happening. New users coming to Linux today are not the same as the ones from a decade ago. They're not tinkerers first. They're gamers, creators, students, professionals. They don't want ideology, they want results. And Linux is finally delivering those results without asking them to sacrifice their favorite tools. The phrase "just works" used to be associated with other platforms. Now it's being whispered in Linux communities with a mix of pride and disbelief, because when Windows apps run natively enough that users forget they're Windows apps, something fundamental has changed. This doesn't mean Windows is dead tomorrow, far from it, but it does mean Windows is no longer inevitable, and inevitability was always its greatest weapon. What makes this moment especially interesting is that Linux didn't win by copying Windows UI or chasing its features. It won by being open, modular, and adaptable, by letting the community solve problems in parallel, by allowing Valve, codeweavers, independent developers, and hobbyists to push the same tools forward in different ways. Centralized control would have killed this progress. Openness enabled it. We're also seeing distributions leaning into this reality. Some are optimizing specifically for compatibility layers. Others are shipping with Proton and Wine pre-configured. Some are branding themselves as Windows app-friendly without shame. That would have been unthinkable years ago. Now, it's a selling point. And let's not ignore the emotional impact. For longtime Linux users, this feels like vindication. For Windows users curious about Linux, this removes fear. Fear of losing apps. Fear of incompatibility. Fear of being stuck. When fear disappears, experimentation begins. And once people experiment, many don't go back. There's a quiet revolution happening, and it doesn't come with a press event or a keynote. It happens when someone installs Linux on their main machine, installs their favorite Windows app, and realizes they don't need Windows anymore. No drama, no announcement, just a realization. That's how real change happens. Linux didn't just change one thing, it changed the rules. Windows apps no longer define where you must live, they're guests now, and Linux is a very comfortable host. The question is no longer can Linux run Windows apps. The question is why are we still pretending Windows is required at all? And once that question takes root, there's no going back.